Okay, we're getting ready to do or mark out our joints for our mortise and tenon joints for the upholstered stool. You've already at a point where you know how to cut out all of your timber so that you've got the amount of timber that you have. Here we've got our 3 long rails, which are these ones here, and I've already broken up some of my pieces into set of legs and set of rails for each of the ends. The tools you're going to need for marking out your mortise and tenon joint are up the front here. So you got a tri-square, you got a mortise gauge, which is like a marking gauge, but it has 2 spikes just here, so you can mark out the actual mortise size. You'll need a marking gauge, ruler, and obviously a pencil. Now generally with a mortise and tenon joint, you've got 2 general parts. Here you can see this part here, the pin is known as the tenon. The section that has the hole is known as the mortise. Traditionally, once this was marked out, you would use a mortising chisel to basically dig out all of this section. We've got a different method here at school for doing that, where we're using a drill and a jig, and then we're using some traditional tools for marking out the tenon section of the job. And they'll basically fit together. It provides a good strong joint, gives you better gluing surface area. As a general rule, a mortise and tenons should be 1/3 of the thickness of the joint, of the timber. So you have 1/3 of the thickness, then the mortise is 1/3 of the thickness, and then you've got 1/3 of the thickness there as well. This is roughly what it is. Our timber here is 19 mil thick. Our mortise is 6.5 mil, which is roughly 1/3. When you'd be doing this traditionally, you'd be using a 6 mil chisel or the old 1/4 inch chisel. We're using a 6.5 mil drill bit to cut out our actual mortises. When you want to set out your joints, this is the one job where doing your face side and face edge is really important. We want to set out this shape here. So we're having the legs set out and our top and bottom rail. We can see that our bottom rail is 100 millimeters from the bottom of the leg, and our top rail is flush with the top. When you're setting out your face side and face edges, generally you're basically saying that I've got my favourite face and my favourite edge. This is going to be the inside of the joint, or the inside of the job. Here I've got another nice one here, so that's going to be setting out inside. Now our rails when you sit them next to your job, you go, wow, that looks really large, doesn't look like the picture. Remembering that we've got a 30 mil joint at each end for the tenon, so 60 mil of this length is actually being taken off with joints. Again, I want my best face and my edge facing inside. Face and my edge, so I'm facing them inside like this. Now before I start doing any sort of marking out, I want to have them all matched up, ready to go. So I'm going to label my joints. So I've got an A, B, C, D. I'm going to be marking them in here as well. Because I'm going to be removing this section here, I don't want to put my lettering too close to the edge, so I'm coming in a bit for my marking out. And I also want to mark out how high, and I'm hoping that I'm pretty close to where I want to be. If I mark up 100 mil. Now one way to make sure that you get these both exactly the same, I'm going to do a light line for where the edge of that is, match up my 2 legs, and transfer that mark across. Now that is where the bottom of the rail is going to be. So my rails will line up in this position. Now, as I said, our tenons are going to be 30mm in length. So I want to measure in 30, and again, I can do some of my measurements in matching pairs. So I'm coming in 30 on both sides. I'll transfer these lines here. You'll notice I'm putting the pencil on the dot and then sliding my tri-square up to it. That way I'm guaranteed to be right on my spot. And now I can also transfer those across from piece to piece. Some people might call this cheating, but it's actually just making sure that your jobs are marked out as a matching set. So now I've got that. Now these measurements need to be transferred all the way around. So I'll transfer all of these lines all the way around. So we're marking out basically the shoulder of the tenon joint. Do it on the other rail. So I basically now have the spacing for the joints marked out. For where the joints are going to be on the side, I'm going to use the thickness of my timber to give me a position. And I already know where the bottom of this joint needs to be. And again, use the thickness of the timber to mark out where the top of the timber will end up being. I've got the bottom of my joint marked out. I've marked where the top of it's going to be, and now I'm putting some reference marks onto my timber as well. Again, I can grab my other leg and transfer those marks across. That way I'm actually marking out in a matching pair, and I know that the measurements are going to be the exact same on both of the pieces. Now this is where the mortise gauge is going to come in. As I said, the mortise gauge has 2 pins, so it's marking out where the inside of the joint is. We have this set to the thickness of our drill bit, which is going to be drilling it out. And so that all of our measurements are even, or even from the same sides, we need to make sure that this part of the marking gauge, or the mortise gauge, is always against the face side of our pieces of timber. So for marking out our rails, or marking out our tenons on our rails, we get our marking gauge, our mortise gauge, rested against our face edge, or face side, rest the timber part of the gauge against our job, lower it until the pins touch the timber, and then just scribe backwards. Scribe across the top. End grain's usually hard, and scribe off the other end. Now, they're usually a little difficult to see. Sometimes you can get a pencil, run it inside your lines, and they'll stand out just a little bit better for you. But after a while you start to get used to what scratch is the one that you want to have. So I'll do that at the other end as well. As I said, end grain's always the hardest one. So I've now got the width of those tenons marked out. So I've got those set. Now, we don't want our tenons to be all the way to the top of the timber of the rail. If we did so, then our mortise would pop out at the top of the job. So we need to make sure that we have our tenons a little bit smaller. For this job, we're going to make them 10 mm in from the edge, and this is where we use the marking gauge. Get it to roughly 10 mm. Use a ruler to check it. Now I've got it at 10 mm. Now because I'm just going parallel to the edge, it doesn't matter which side I'm going on, but I just want to make sure that I am keeping it nice and firm against the side of the timber. Couple of marks. And what that ends up leaving us with is a rectangle of timber on the end, which that is going to be our actual tenon. All of this section here will be gone. So I'll get those marked out as well. So I've got my top rail done. Now for marking out our mortises, we want to make sure that we don't go using the mortise gauge and going too far along. Even though we won't see it, you want to make sure you don't come outside these lines. But so that we're not marking out where we don't really need to, we just get a ruler, put a mark at 10 mm in from the top and bottom of where the timber should be. And that's going to give us a guide for our mortise gauge. Now I'm lightly marking these, and I'm not going all the way to the end side of the timber so I don't go getting them confused with my actual other markings. I've now got that there. I get my mortise gauge against my face side and just scratch in between the two guidelines. So now if I make those stand out just a little bit, you can see that here is my mortise mark. This is where my mortise is going to be cut. And if I sit those two together, you can see that the mortise and the tenon are pretty much a matching shape, and they should be also the same distance from my face side of my timber, so that when they're put together, this surface here and this surface here will line up beautifully. You need to make sure that you continue that with each of your legs, all of your rails and legs on your other side. When you're setting out your opposite sides, if I set, that's one set aside there, I get my other set, which I had already done my face side, face edge marks on. To match these joints up, I don't want to go A, B, C, D, just like I've done on there, because then I might get a piece here mixed up with this side. So this one, I'll start with E, go E, F, G, and H, and E, F, G, H. And I'll go through the same process, marking out all of those joints. So that's how to set out and mark out the joints. The next part will be drilling of the mortise and clearing that out, and also cutting of the tenons.